I'd like to welcome everyone to to this talk that's being sponsored by the UCSD Libraries. I'm going to do something that's a little bit unorthodox at this point. I'd like the members of the Outreach Committee to stand, please. Gayatri, Rachel, Shauna, where are you? Oh, they could be working, but what I wanted to say is to take this opportunity to say that this is a group of women and a committee that has worked tirelessly and totally selflessly to put on the exhibit in the library and also this program. And oftentimes, people don't realize the depth of work that's required for a program like this. And because we're running late, I didn't want people to file out and miss the thank you to the committee. So thank you, and I'm going to introduce Patrick McCarthy. He is the head of the Social Science and Humanities Library.
Thanks, Dorothea. All right, I'd also like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's event. Every year, the Social Sciences and Humanities Outreach Committee puts on an event for the African American History Month. And every year, I always look forward to it because they put on such outstanding events. And last year, I was wondering how they were going to top the quilting, the history of African American quilting exhibit, which was excellent and well received. But again, they always seem to kind of top what they did the year before. Which I'll also point out, if you haven't seen, they are raffling off another quilt this year. So if you didn't win last year, be sure to buy tickets. You got another chance this year. All right, I'm going to introduce the moderator for today, and then he will kind of introduce the panel of speakers. Okay. So our moderator is Dr. Daniel Widener. He is an associate professor in the Department of History, where he's been here since 2003. He teaches African American history, cultural studies, and 20th century political radicalism. So he credits his interest in politics and history to his parents and the Los Angeles Police Department. So I'm sure there's some interesting stories in there. He began his educational career at the Echo Park People's Child Care Center. He is a Los Angeles native. He has undergraduate degrees from the University of California, Berkeley, and a doctorate from NYU in American history. He has recently authored a book titled Black Arts West, Culture and Struggles in Black Los Angeles, 1942 to 1992, Duke University Press. So please join me in welcoming our moderator, Dr. Daniel Widener.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I want to take this opportunity also to thank the program committee and the library as well for what promises to be really a fascinating and fantastic discussion. I'm not going to say much because the focus rightfully should be on our guests, their histories, their expertise, and the things that you as the audience and they as the panelists have to say about our current moment and the lessons for our present day struggles that we can locate in the past. I do want to say just a couple of things about each of our guests by way of framing their presence here and just as a way to help perhaps guide some of what you may want to bring to the table or what you may want to ask in the Q&A that will follow their introductory remarks. The first of our speakers is Dr. James Garrett. Dr. James Garrett and I are former co-workers We taught together in the Department of Pan-African Studies at California State University of Northridge. But I knew him already by that time, both through his writing. He wrote a series of plays in the 1960s that were part of my dissertation and went into my manuscript, but also by his political biography. My parents were activists in Southern California, and my uncle was the mayor of Berkeley. And in each of those contexts, James Garrett's name was a very familiar name. In the time since then, and in the time since his activism around race, radicalism, and justice in the United States, he's been active on as many continents as have political struggles. To the best of my knowledge, he's never been particularly active in Antarctica. So you may want to address that before transitioning over to the other side. At present, he has two really exciting projects that I just want to call attention to, because I think, as is the case with each of our three speakers, they really attest to the extent to which each of our panelists and guests today is a person who's been a lifelong struggler for change. So I think Dr. Garrett will maybe tell us a little bit about both his work in Vietnam, where he's involved in a project that seeks to undo some of the legacy of warfare that our country visited upon the Vietnamese people, and a project in Sierra Leone that he has going on as well. Our second speaker is a man who really doesn't need much introduction, certainly not by me, as he is our current mayor, Bob Filner. But I will say a couple of things about Mayor Filner. I'll say, for the first, he's one of only 3 Democrats I have managed in the course of my short life to be able to vote for. One of whom I was related to, and he's the only one who I've ever worked for, including the person I'm related to. So I think that attests to really the extent to which he is a progressive voice in a place that very few of us would describe as a progressive place, at least not initially. What's important, I think, in the context of our conversation today is that Mayor Filner really has a 40-year political history, a 50-year political history of struggling, of identifying strategic places to make change, and of making really principled and intelligent decisions about how to bring forward a progressive agenda in all kinds of different contexts. So I would be principally interested in hearing his take on what was a more difficult place to bring forward change, early 21st century San Diego or late 20th century Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, and the like. Perhaps his answer will surprise us. And finally, but certainly not most least, is Dr. Carol Wayman, who I think probably we could agree on is the person most responsible for us being able to have both this event today and more generally to be able to consider San Diego a tolerable place to live. I'm a member of the zoo, as probably any of you who are parents are. And I will say that every time I walk into the zoo with my children,
just happened to have it.
oh yeah, ready, just happened to be there. I'm really grateful to him and the other veterans of his generation for helping to make San Diego a place where a black family can walk and feel not tolerated, but welcome. I think we use this term of toleration quite loosely in public today, and it underscores the extent to which a previous generation of activists fought to make spaces like the beach, the zoo, the parks, El Cajon Boulevard, restaurants, places that, that our children, that our families can go and be safe and be welcome and be respected. And so I think that's a lesson that it's really critical for at least me as a young parent to be able to impart onto my kids. So I will say a little bit more about his own political biography in terms of the really critical work he's done around education, around access, around desegregation, the work he's done to build institutions, whether institutions like the NAACP locally or his work with Somali youth, which is a topic of great importance in the neighborhood that I live into. So mostly I think what I mean to say today to all three of our panelists, but in particular to Dr. Wayman, is thank you. So I guess that will conclude my welcome, and I'll introduce and ask Dr. Garrett to come up and begin in earnest.
I want to thank everybody. Brother Widener, who we've had some activities together, so we know. I wanted to just acknowledge one of my teachers first, Brother Ayusi Kwayana, who is a person from Guyana who's now living in the United States, who was one of the three key people who was involved in the development and the establishment of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana. Great writer, great thinker, like Brother Widener speaking about Brother Wayman. I mean, Ayusi's in the back. I don't know if he wants to stand up. He's too modest for words, but he's a good brother. And I can't be in a room without acknowledging him. I have to say I've been very fortunate, and I'll go through this as quickly as I can, very quickly. I want to thank the library and its committee, particularly my comrade at arms, Dorothea Stewart, who is, well, the people around her know how hard-working she is, so I'll leave that alone. But I've been working with her for, I guess, 15, 17 years, trying to develop statewide community and statewide community struggles. So she's one of those people who's unsung, but doesn't make her any less a hero because she's unsung. The civil rights movement characterized and defined most of my life. I was born in apartheid, and it just so happens it was in Texas. It could have been Louisiana or Texas because we were migrant workers and moved back and forth between the cotton fields in the spring and summer and fall, and then many times in the cane fields where we burned and then cut cane. So I grew up in that kind of setting, and then moved to California, which had de jure segregation that was as intense as de facto segregation was in the South. I went to Jefferson High School and East Los Angeles College. I did all the whole bit. And I was in Los Angeles. I mean, I don't know, I think that we thought that San Diego was the place that you pass through to get to Tijuana. But of course, I grew up at a time when we call them clubs, street gangs were prominent, and I was on my way to becoming a ward of the government for the rest of my life. I was in an organization called the Businessmen, which was with the Slossons, one of the two biggest gangs in LA. And then what happened was that, again, I made good grades at Jefferson High. I went south. My parents sent me south in 1960, back to Dallas to get me out of trouble with the gangs. And I got arrested 7 times in the sit-ins with the NAACP Youth Council. And I'm telling you, if it had not been for that, I mean, because I had nerve. I mean, many of us had courage. And many of us had this level of energy, a good part of it being anger, undirected. And the movement created a cocoon for people like myself, because I would have been dead, because I fought. I mean, I like to fight. I weighed about 100 pounds, soaking wet. And the other thing is that I was a track person, so I could run when I couldn't fight. So the movement created this cocoon, and it nurtured in many different ways. And so I was inside the kernel. I was inside the cocoon. And there were a number of people who helped me on my way. I was involved in the sit-ins in 1960, as I said. At 16, the next year, after I was on the Freedom Rides, and spent 27 days in the New Orleans Parish Prison, and did all the, talk about the terror to, some days were in solitary confinement and this and that and the other. And the idea, I think, was to try to break people from doing these things. So I remember when the Freedom Rides didn't have a good name. Freedom Rides were denounced, first as a communist activity and character assassinations, all that. What happens over time, just like with Martin Luther King, who in 1965, the two most hated black people were Malcolm X because he supported segregation or separation, and Martin Luther King because he supported integration. What happens is that the reshaping of our memories is so intense that one can go from John Lewis being looked upon as some kind of hoodlum because he was a person who kept going on the Freedom Rides to being one of the heroes, icons of our time. That's how our memories get shaped. And one way to shape those memories is to pluck out the individuals from the mass. With me, the best things about the movement, now Bob Moses taught me how to organize. And Bob Moses is a person in SNCC who taught me that it was important not to seek that visibility that was necessary for me to reinforce myself. Reinforce yourself by earning your insurgency. If you want the people to rise up, don't tell them they should rise up because Karl Marx wants them to rise up or because somebody else wants them to rise up. Get with the people, and the rising up will both rise them and you. Because all they need to be, in many cases, what needs to happen is if they see that an example of self-sacrifice, and you get knocked down and you get up and you keep going back and what you're doing is you're earning that respect, you're earning the insurgency. And then at the same time, if you respect those people and their knowledge that you're not the banker of knowledge, that they are in fact the bankers of knowledge. They know their own history, they know their own culture, and what you're doing is simply helping to unlock it by simply building a relationship with them. So I got very fortunate, I'm very fortunate for that. It was what we call the local people who really educated me. I have all the degrees that Dr. Widener and others were listing out, but the best education I got, it came from the people. That's earning your insurgency. That's a critical piece for me because it suggests at some point that's what we have to do with some critical mass of our young people in the modern era. And by 1966, the Urban League had done the survey and came out with the notion that there were 10,000 organizers in the United States. I was talking to a group of young black men the other day about that, and they couldn't even get it in their minds that there would be that many people who had dedicated their lives to social transformation, because it's hard to believe. Well, that's because there was an atmosphere created, a nurturing for these people to come into being. It's as Cabral said, I'm a simple African man doing my duty in my own country in the context of our time. Simply means that we were not great people who did simple things. We were ordinary people who got a chance to participate in tremendous things. We were very lucky. It's much more difficult now to earn your insurgency because now there's an expectation and there are programs to destroy young people before they get to the point where they can have that energy, part anger and part undirected, pulled together and nurtured and succored. It's a very difficult place to be right now for young people, to get them to get that energy freed up and directed in a way, in a transformative way, in a socially transformative way. Second piece, and then I'll be through. the civil rights movement itself, so far as I'm concerned, comes out of it's not Rosa Parks sitting on on the bus and that started it, and it's not Martin Luther King gave us our civil rights. These are the kind of things my son was taught when he was going to high school. And I had to press him, I had to go back and drive it into the teacher, because many times the teachers didn't know. They were trained to be, and I'm talking about college professors too, they were trained to be trained to be backward, so what they taught is backwardness. No, Martin Luther King came out of a context. Rosa Parks, 5 years to get to that place of sitting on the bus, 5 years of planning to get to that one act. All the people who fell by the wayside in that 5 years to get to that point. Now, so it's not the incident, it's building to the incident. Civil rights movement from me and my family begins in 1938 when my great uncle was lynched. He's developmentally disabled. He had been sent to town to the general store outside of Marshall, Texas, and a group of white men on a Friday had their little notion of kill a nigger on Friday, get drunk on Saturday, go to church on Sunday, and it just so happens that my great uncle was that person. So my family then, on my father's side, became very, very intense about their positions on a lot of political things.
Did they kill him?
They castrated him, killed him, and left him in a ditch. So that's one of two lynchings in my family. So that's when the civil rights movement begins for us. It's also a good time because it's a time when we're 4 years into this nation being pacified. The Chiricahua Apaches, Geronimo's people are finally pacified in 1934. A few years later, the U.S. is involved in a world war and emerges out of that war the single great power on earth. Now here's a country who's 4 years pacified, still lynching people, but is now the global leader, the hegemonic force in the world. Now, what do you do with that? How do you structure that? Well, what's going to happen is that the U.S. is going to replace both Japan and the European powers in the world as the on-site, the grounded ones who are going to restructure and rebuild the whole world. But what do they do about the internal contradictions, the internal dynamics? Talcott Parsons. Well, they already had Keynes to deal with the financial part of it, the consolidation of international finance capital. But Talcott Parsons, who was a sociologist, who went from being a conservative sociologist to a liberal sociologist sort of in his day, out of Harvard, had structured an idea of what came to be known as the liberal coalition. The idea was to homogenize America over a period of about 100 years, while dealing with its place in the world as the world leader. So you have white people, white men coming back from the war, supplanting Rosie the Riveter, some of them, and the other group of white men who were more educated, spreading out over the globe, taking over the world. But during the period from 1948 to 1968, the manufacturing sector in the United States increased its value by 400% in 40 years. So that growth and development meant that's why there's an English Ford. That's why in Japan, up until recently, until about 15 years ago, 15% of all of the value of their automobiles, the automobile industry, was owned by American companies. Why is that? That's because the United States was the dominant economic force in the world. So now how do you deal with the internal things? Talcott Parsons thought that it should be dealt with at an incremental level, that you had to find a way to build and develop an educated sector to replace those who were going to move on, but you had to do it in a safe way. And he developed this sense of social engineering that would mean that there would be some inclusion for blacks and others. But he wanted it to take place incrementally, and they thought the first way to deal with it was through education, and it's out of that mode that we get the 1954 Supreme Court decision. Problem was that there was a push from the bottom, from the mass of people, from workers in factories who were coming back from the war, from the movement of blacks and in fact the bringing in of hundreds of thousands of Mexican nationals into this country to participate in the labor structure that will push from all these people who were locked in to a feudal structure in the Deep South, a feudal structure many times on farms and plantations in the Deep South, and the representation of those plantations by people like James O. Eastland. I was in prison, in Parchman Prison, and didn't know until I got out of prison that James Eastland, Senator James Eastland, owned the land on which, I said, I don't know how I could have cut those watermelons had I known that James O. Eastland owned the product. But at the end of the day, what happens is that you have a pressure coming downward and upward against the Old South. From the north, you had the need to mechanize more quickly the South. There's a need to deal with the international contradictions of being the great force in the world for freedom, while at the same time enjoying an apartheid, a segregation that was so strict that it became the paradigm for apartheid in South Africa. It became the model for apartheid in South Africa. How do you deal with that? It's in that context, so far as I'm concerned, that the civil rights movement emerges. Civil rights movement comes out of that. The question is, the question for the people who ruled was, how do you manage that energy? And that's what, from 1960, I would gather, until probably 1968, the watershed years, the struggle between many people in the civil rights movement and the people who rule. That's international finance capital. That's like the Chase Bank, Sears. As a staff worker for SNCC, I was paid $18.90 every 2 weeks. They took Social Security and taxes out. But my check came from a foundation that was founded by Sears Roebuck. Much of the movement was funded by the Ford Foundation, Carnegie Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. It was funded, and in many cases managed by the Democratic Party, Catholic and Jewish philanthropy, managed. The movement in many ways was managed. And the struggle was, how do you get to deal with deal with the conditions of the people within the context of being managed by the Parsonian means and the liberal coalition? That was a struggle. 1963, and I'll stop with 1963. 1963, the March on Washington was classic, because you had people who had spent all this time with local people, working with local people, who wanted to speak the voice of local people, like John Lewis. Although John Lewis didn't write the speech, about 6 people from SNCC wrote it. It was a hard speech. I mean, they talked about marching like Sherman. And that, you talking about calling up things in the Deep South, you start talking like marching like Sherman. That's a scorched earth policy of a certain kind. And the people who were organizing the march had to deal with that energy. Here are people who did not want to betray their base, their constituency on one hand, and on the other hand had to deal with the fact that some people were trying to manage this incremental shift, this incremental process. Hey, war going on back to stage. First, you're not going to have any women speaking. None. No women spoke. Not Dorothy Height, no. So you already had a gender split. Then you had the internal struggles that were going on. Those kinds of activities, those fissures, over time from 63 to 66, very quickly. I mean, they ripped open the movement and created the Black Power movement, created the white youth anti-war movement. It created, ultimately, women's studies, the women's movement, because the women's movement comes out of people like Casey Hayden, at least the modern women's movement. Casey Hayden, who was a SNCC worker, a white woman, was a SNCC worker. So all these things begin to explode. And all I wanted to do is try to put it in context, because there's a tendency to separate those of us who are still alive as if we were somehow different from other people. Frantz Fanon says, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. We were a group of young people who luckily were nurtured by a number of people to help us to discover our mission. But we were ordinary people who got a chance to participate in an extraordinary period of history. And for that, we are grateful. And if we're smart, we're humble. Thank you very much.
One of the wonderful things about Dr. Garrett is that he is able to have both a local and a national and an international perspective all at once. And one of the things I find interesting about, we put the speakers alphabetically, but in many ways, the pattern of our talks distills into a conversation about San Diego. Our next speaker comes originally to us from Pittsburgh, I believe it is, by way of many points in between. And so I'm hoping that Mayor Filner will be able to reflect a little bit on his career as a progressive, his career as an activist, his continuing time as an elected official, and some of his observations about different places and times, and what kind of connective threads and tissues he finds all through those moments of his continuing and very important political biography. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Garrett, for being here. It's a pleasure to share the platform with you. We just went through a campaign here for mayor, and so I've been mayor for 2 months, and one of the great lines I thought I used was, the previous mayor was a police chief in San Diego. The present mayor started his career in jail. And I think that's a step forward. Turns out we were in Parchment together. I don't know if you were we had the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides recently, and the authorities allowed us for the first time to go back to the state penitentiary, Parchment. Were you there? Were you there?
No, not for the 50th.
Yeah, okay. We were able to see the actual jail cells, which still existed when we first were arrested, and they put us in Parchment. They issued us T-shirts. They took all our clothes and gave us a little T-shirt and gym shorts and said, MSU. So I said, great, Mississippi State, you know. I'm a cougar or whatever there. But no, it meant maximum security unit. We were on death row. Yes. And it was the only way they could figure out how to have an integrated cell block. But, I mean, they wanted to keep us separate from other prisoners, and to do that, they even integrated a cell block for the first time in Mississippi history. So we were in these very strange cells operated electronically, and we never saw each other. We were in cells side by side. So even if Jim and I were there, can I call you Jim? That's fine. We're there at the same time, we never saw each other because we had to have these strange meetings because there was a row of 15 or so, I guess,